Hi, I'm Joel Gunn. I'm your instructor for Social Science, a senior seminar. One of our main things that we want to acquire and assure ourselves of this term is that we have a good grasp of what theory is and have understanding of how to use theory to solve problems. And so let's think about theory for a minute. A theory is like, an idea that you get out of the air. It's something that probably isn't culturally acceptable, because if it was culturally acceptable, it would be ho-hum, old guard stuff, and who wants to hear about that? But you're going to come up with a new idea. It's not going to be culturally acceptable, and so you want to use proofs to bring it into the cultural mainstream. And so one of the ways that science guards against starting too early on asserting the validity of a theory is to propose it as a hypothesis and then get some proof together, and eventually it might come to something. It may take a long time. You think about Albert Einstein's theory of how the universe works and everything, and it's been over 100 years since I guess probably about exactly 100 years since Einstein came up with his theory of how the universe works, and said one of the consequences of the way this universe works is that there's going to be gravity waves. Like if you have a star exploding 13 billion light years away, well, it may take that long for the gravity wave to get here, but eventually, after a century, scientists finally figured out a way using lasers, which, as far as I know, in 1917, Einstein had never heard of, and all kinds of stuff, and they were able to catch one of these gravity waves zooming by. So proving a theory can be a long, drawn-out affair. I don't expect that any of you will be concerned with theory at those levels very soon, although I hope that you make it there someday. But what main concern now is that you just have a concept of theory and how to apply it to problem solving. So let's say that you have this theory, this idea about social sciences. We'll be working with the idea about how the status of a person, his social status, his racial status, and his gender status affect a person's way of life and thinking about themselves and all of that. And the way we're going to approach this is that we will, you'll come up with some ideas about the way you think in a given situation. We're going to study several situations, and you're going to come up with an idea about how this social situation is going to affect people who have different statuses in different social categories. We'll be primarily concerned with gender, race, and class. And then you're going to explain to me some kind of a proof that you have come up with. And in order to do this, you need some kind of a mechanism to, a mutually agreed upon language to to talk about what these relationships are. And ordinarily this is done in terms of statistics or whatever, but just to make it simple and something that we can fly right into. Actually, I'll give you an article that you can try it statistically if you're inclined, but mainly we're just going to try it with something called Venn diagrams. Venn diagrams are just a matter of playing with circles. Let's take these little circles for example, and by manipulating these circles, well, you can get some idea of what the overlapping factors are. We're concerned with how what happens when a person gets caught in more than one of these circles. Like, let's say that green is for gender and yellow is for race, and if and every society has different ways of treating these different overlapping situations. The first one that you'll encounter is how African American women are treated relative to class. And so now let's say that you're studying a society where class has no effect on race, and those are pretty rare in the world, but they do occur in certain kind of limited situations. Something that comes to mind is that before about 1800, when the Moravians came to North Carolina, they had no real concept of race, and so if an African American came to Winston-Salem and they proved to be effective, at working in the foundry, why then they could work their way right up to the top of the foundry and become the person who controlled the foundry. And that was, of course, very different from after about 1800, when slavery became such a powerful force in American society, and then African Americans were excluded after that from making those positions. So if you took our race and class thing here before 1800, well, you would see that they're kind of overlapping, and one doesn't have much of an influence on the other. But then after 1800, well, the overlapping became less and less, and if you were of a racial category, well, you went out the bottom of the class system, and started having separate churches for African Americans and all kinds of racial things. So that's kind of one way of looking at the circles of Venn diagrams. You can also play with the sizes of Venn diagrams. Like, we'll be talking a lot about New Orleans this term, and in New Orleans you have a very large African American population, about 60% of the population. You have relatively small 40% of the population that's made up of every conceivable person and kind of person in the world. It's a port city, and that's just the way port cities are. Well, but anybody who goes to New Orleans and claims any kind of citizenship there is going to be taken in by the African American part. They're going to learn some things about jazz and other African American traditions, and so they're going to be, in a sense, totally consumed by African American culture, and by Native American culture for that matter. Because in the early days in New Orleans, where there was a lot of intermixing between African American and Native American cultures. Now, when it comes down to the practicalities of this, the reason that we're using Venn diagrams is so that you can communicate to me what your theory is about how people in, let's say, New Orleans interact with each other. And look at these two things. Where's the interaction here? It's not in race, and it's not in race, and it's not in class. It's in the overlap between these things. So let's say that. So let's just separate this race and class thing out here and get down to the important part of it. So we have this piece here, which is called the intersection between race and class. And in the discussions that you'll present, well, you'll present your theory about how race and class interact with each other. And the main thing you want to do is not confuse me about what you're talking about. Like if you have a whole bunch of domains, some people like really fancy, complicated Venn diagrams, and you know, all kinds of stuff going on and everything. And if you look at this, the potential overlaps here, why it's got to be, at least a dozen or so of them. So what I want you to do, if you want to talk about the implications of this particular intersection in your complicated Venn diagram, then I have to have some way of knowing about it. So you can give it some kind of a label, like A. And when you're talking about this particular piece of the intersection of Venn diagrams, you need to not only label it in your Venn diagram that you'll make up and put into your discussion of your theory, but you'll need to, in that discussion, refer to this A so that I know what you're talking about. So that's the basic skill that you need to acquire in terms of language. This is all of us coming up and learning to speak a language so that we can understand each other, and so you can tell me why you're so convinced that your theory of how race and class work together is important and useful.